We're sorry, but there's plenty of people in England haven't seen us unless we do a world telly show and everybody watches at once through a satellite. That's the only way everybody would see us.
The Get Back sessions was not the only time that the Beatles had agreed to be filmed recording. That was on one warm Sunday night on the 25th of June 1967, when the Beatles performed live their next single, All You Need Is Love, as part of the British contribution for the world's first ever global TV satellite programme. George Martin picks up the story.
Sure. It was a commission that was Brian suddenly whirled in and said, we are to represent Britain in this round the world hookup, and you've got to write a song.
Our World was conceived by the BBC and broadcast over 2 hours in 24 countries with an estimated audience of over 500 million people, easily the largest television audience up to that date. The Beatles' 6 minutes contribution appeared in the Artistic Excellence segment towards the end, which also included Zeffirelli directing rehearsals for Romeo and Juliet in Tuscany and Leonard Bernstein conducting Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 in New York. The contract had been signed in May, but it was only a few weeks before the broadcast that John's new song was selected. Much of the recording had been done at Olympic Sound Studios in Barnes, southwest London, 2 weeks after the release of Sgt. Pepper's and 2 weeks before the day of the historic live broadcast. 33 tracks were taped at Olympic, with the Beatles playing some quite unfamiliar instruments. John played harpsichord, Paul the double bass, whilst George plucked away gamely at a violin. Returning to EMI Studio 3 the following week, the Beatles overdub lead and backing vocals, drums, guitar and banjo onto take 10 of the Olympic sessions.
All you need is love, love, love is all you need.
The orchestra was not used for its own overdubs until the Friday before the broadcast. The 13-man orchestra was conducted by Mike Vickers, ex-Manfred Mann saxophonist and multi-instrumentalist. A masterful score came courtesy of George Martin. The day before the live broadcast, and quite exceptionally, the doors of EMI Studios in Abbey Road were flung open to welcome over 100 journalists and press photographers. The Beatles posed for publicity shots taken in the backyard and inside before rehearsing in the afternoon in the cavernous Studio 1 for the first time with the orchestra. At some stage, they slipped off to the EMI canteen and indulged in a cup of tea and some relaxing chat, attracting considerable attention as ever. On the day itself, to minimise the risk of any cock-ups, the Beatles performed to the Take 10 rhythm track recorded at Olympic Studios, as George Martin explains.
And there was an orchestra that was live, and the singing was live, and certain audience and so on. And we knew it was going to be a live television show.
However, the vocals, Paul's bass, Ringo's drums, George's lead guitar, and the orchestra were all playing live. Can be seen relaxing with then girlfriend Jane Asher during breaks. When the other musicians went to lunch, the Beatles could not resist having a go on their abandoned instruments. It was also the last time the Beatles were to be seen photographed with their manager Brian Epstein before his death. Just before the live performance, we can see a dutiful Mal Evans collecting empty cups of tea. Geoff Emerick is seen manning the console desk under the watchful eye of ever dapper-looking George Martin. According to Geoff Emerick, they went to air 40 seconds earlier than expected, and there was a big panic to hide his and George Martin's Scotch whisky underneath the console. According to tape op Richard Lush, John was extremely nervous on the day itself, despite having rehearsed so many times over the previous day. A host of Beatle friends were present, including two Stones, a watchful Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, as well as Eric Clapton. Mick Jagger wore a silk jacket with psychedelic eyes painted on the back, with Marianne Faithfull smoking a large joint the day before they were busted for drugs. He faced Paul perched on a high stool, same as John and George. Paul's brother Mike sat nearest George, whilst Keith Moon fooled around with Ringo's drum kit. Other guests included Patty Harrison, Jane Asher, Graham Nash, biographer Hunter Davies, and assorted small faces. All were dressed in the colourful clothes of swinging London, surrounded by flowers, balloons, and placards. Amongst the placards was one created by Paul himself for his Aunt Millie, who was away in Australia. Millie was married to one Uncle Albert, who would later serve as inspiration for Paul's first ever solo US #1 single. David Mason had already played on several Beatles sessions and brought in the same piccolo trumpet he had used on Penny Lane. Here he was to play parts from Bach's Brandenburg Concerto in the fade-out. It was George Martin who was given a free hand to arrange the play-out, which incorporated parts of Greensleeves and In the Mood. 2 weeks later, this single was released and went on to top most of the world's singles charts.
And at Cape Kennedy and the United States of America, cameras are already looking at Saturn V rocket, which has started its countdown. And in London, they're a recording studio where the Beatles are in the middle of a recording session. These people and places are just a few of the ingredients in our program.